This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a doctoral fellow at the Archaeology and Land of Israel Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University, whose research focuses on Israel's immigration policy towards the Ethiopian Jewish community in the early years, that is, in the immediate wake of the enactment of the Law of Return in 1950. Then the doors of the young Israel were open to millions of Jews from around the world, but not to Beta Israel, Ethiopia's centuries-old Jewish community. Why? This is exactly what we're here to find out. Meital Regev, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
So what can you tell us about Beta Israel in the 1950s and about their relationship to Judaism?
Okay, Beta Israel, or the Ethiopian Jews as they like to be called, actually started the relation with Israel starting from the 40s of the former century, of the 19th century.
From the 1840s on.
Exactly. But the relation got closer in the 40s when Rabbi Yosef Halevi discovered them, as we can say, and then let his students take care of them and to strengthen the relations with Israel. Actually, they wanted to let the Jewish world to know the Ethiopian Jews and to get them into the Jewish nation.
Mm-hmm. Were they fully fledged Jews, just like any other Jewish community in the world? Or
Well,
did they have specific?
Well, they weren't exactly as Jewish as the Orthodox extremes saw them. They weren't fully Jewish because they were separated long ago for hundreds of years. So they needed to know or to recognize or to strengthen their Jewishness in order to get full recognition in the Jewish nation. However, the Jews in the world and also in Israel, the chief rabbis in Israel in the 20s, for example, they saw them as part of the Jewish nation, and they understood that we need to strengthen the relation with them in order to strengthen the Jewishness.
Mm-hmm. What are the origins of the community and their Judaism?
They were exiled hundreds of years ago. They were exiled like the 10 tribes, and they were spreading the world like the rest of the Jewish tribes. And they were settled in Africa. Now, we don't have a certain or a specific evidence for their history, but we know that they were found in Africa, in Ethiopia. And from my concern, this is the main point. This is the interesting thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were found there. They kept the Jewish customs as much as they could, as much as they remember them. But no doubt they needed to strengthen their Jewishness in order to adjust it to the
So when Rabbi Halevi discovered them in the 1840s, he was French, by the way, right?
Yeah, he was French.
Did he immediately know that they were Jews, or did he have any doubt in his mind?
No, he discovered them. He saw them. He saw the Jewish customs. And therefore, he concluded that they have something to do with the lost 10 tribes.
Mm-hmm. So what's the controversy about if it's so clear that they, for so many Orthodox rabbis all along the years, where is the controversy here?
That's what I asked. That's why I began researching this issue. It was very interesting for me. Even after that, I discovered that two groups during the 50s arrived to Israel to study here.
Wait, so. I thought that they made an official request to make Aliyah.
No, they did, but they
were refused.
They were refused. According to the Law of Return, they cannot immigrate to Israel because they weren't fully Jewish.
Okay, so who decided all of a sudden that they weren't fully Jewish, while, as you said, a long line of rabbis before that ruled unequivocally that they were Jewish?
Well, when I started analyzing and researching this issue, I discovered an amazing thing, that it wasn't a question of Jewishness at all. It wasn't a question of halakha. It was a question of culture.
Uh-huh. So even those who turned them down didn't doubt the fact that they were Jewish.
Exactly. Israel had always been in contact with the Ethiopian Jewish, even though they were doubt about their Jewishness. The Jewish Agency, for example, opened schools and educational projects in Ethiopia during the 50s. Missionaries from Israel, from the Jewish Agency, went to Ethiopia to teach the Ethiopian Jews. So once as a state you decide to keep contact with this community, it's a very ambivalent relationship, because you say that you declare that they weren't Jewish. However, you still keep in touch with them. You spend money. You invest money on the educational project, etc.
So what was their goal, the goal of the Jewish Agency in keeping contact with that community, if at the same time they said that they weren't sure about
because they couldn't
Jewishness?
ignore, the Jewish Agency could not ignore the Ethiopian Jews, because many other people, not institutional persons, but private persons like Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the second president, and Jacob Eitelovich, their spiritual father, fought for Beit Israel, for the Ethiopian Jews, and for their recognition in Israel. So even the Israeli public knew about them. Many articles were published.
Was the chief rabbinate ever had to address?
Yes, the chief rabbinate had to decide, but they did not. They decided not to decide.
Oh, so they didn't even decide that they weren't Jewish. They just decided not to decide.
They decided that they have some connection to the Jewish world, but they cannot fully recognize them. Similarly, the Israeli institutions such as the Jewish Agency didn't decide about their status. Now, the amazing thing is that during the 50s, 20 Ethiopian Jews who came to Israel to study here went a giyur, meaning, okay, you could solve the problem if you wanted to.
By converting them.
By converting them, exactly. So if they were converted, you can give them the papers, they can do aliyah, like as other Jewish.
The real reason was cultural
Exactly.
differences.
That
what
was
does that
my
mean?
conclusion.
Is it like
It
they
means-
look at those black Africans and say they are far too backward for us?
First of all, it was the color. We cannot ignore it. Their colors were far different from the other Jewish color that were in Israel, like the North African immigrants, for example.
Yeah, but you could apply the same argument to
Exactly.
the North African community, and some people did, in fact.
Exactly.
Said that they were not modern enough, and
Exactly.
compared to the European Jews.
Exactly. That's why
But they were still allowed to come to Israel.
because they were Jewish. But the Ethiopian, not just that they are black, but their culture is also inferior than the North African Jewish. And Israel had to face, during the 50s, the 60s, and even the 70s, it had to face a lot of intercultural conflicts regarding the problems with culturing the North Africa. I mean, Kura Hituch,
Yeah, the melting pot.
exactly what the policy was, to make the North African Jews as liberal and Western and educated people.
So for the establishment, the Ethiopian Jews were one backward Jewish community too many?
Exactly. It was too much for Israel, especially because the Ethiopian Jewish are coming from comparing to the North African Jews, they were much inferior with their customs and with their culture.
Yet still some managed to infiltrate, as it were, into Israel in those years.
Yes.
What can you tell us about them and how they were received?
After they immigrated to Israel?
During the 50s and 60s, when they made illegal effort to
When they
come to
made
Israel.
illegal efforts, for example, those groups who came from Kfar Batya, even though they were converted, they could not get any papers. I met one of them who actually slept in benches in Tel Aviv. He couldn't work, he couldn't rent an apartment. So even though they were converted and stayed here, Israel didn't look for them.
And then in 1973, Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, later the founder and spiritual leader of Shas, the big ultra-Orthodox party, declared them as unequivocally Jewish. That was really the most clear-cut religious decision issued on it. Was it really a watershed in the way Israel treated the Ethiopian Jewish community?
Well, Rabbi Ovadia declared in 1973, however, we can see that the policy towards the Ethiopian Jews, which started during the 50s and even before that, continues until then. Because even though he declared in 73 about the Judaism, they only immigrated to Israel about 11 years later in 84. And when I continue to research this subject, I discovered that the organization or those who pushed to the immigration of the Ethiopian Jews was the AAEG, the Association of American Jewish, and not Israel. So that was an interesting thing to realize.
And when Rabbi Ovadia came out with his declaration, how was it received among his fellow rabbis in the religious establishment?
Well, actually, he divided the Rabbanut, the chief Rabbanut, into two parts, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. Obviously, Ovadia Yosef saw them as fully Jewish. However, the Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the Ashkenazi rabbi, could not sign this declaration. Only 2 years, in 1975, he finally applied to sign and to declare that they were fully Jewish because the other Ashkenazi rabbis could not agree to recognize the Ethiopian Jews as fully Jewish.
But that didn't affect Israel's immigration policy towards them. As you say, it came only a decade later, and thanks to a non-governmental body rather than the Israeli government.
Yes, but we can see that after their immigration, the Ashkenazi rabbis did not agree to let them study in the Ashkenazi schools, in the Ashkenazi religious schools, for example. So we can see that this policy, the Ashkenazi religious policy, continues to after their immigration. So you can see that the policy starting from the 50s continues even until today, with all these important stations in the 80s and in 91. After the second immigration, the American Jews were also involved in bringing them.
So is it just plain racism, would you say, or is it more
Of course, Israel is a racist country. That's it. We're a complex country. We have racism, we just don't want to speak about it. We don't want to say it loudly.
But how do they justify it? I mean, obviously, the establishment wouldn't say we are officially racist.
They justified it. Well, you can see even today films, documentary films, admiring Israel for taking plans and going into in the night and taking out the Ethiopian, and it looks heroic, but it doesn't. If you don't understand the story, the true story as it is, you really come to believe, you really believe what you see, what the Israeli government wants you to believe in.
So the Israeli government unjustly takes credit for...
Of course, because if you see all the documentary films, you never hear about the AAEJ. You don't hear about the American Jewish involvement. And that's part of the story.
Yeah. A very important part of the story. That's all very interesting, Meital Regev. Thank you very much for joining us here today to share some of your insights from your doctoral research about Israel's immigration policy towards the Ethiopian Jewish community in the 1950s and onwards. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
ושוב אותו ניגון ששרת לי פעם שיר ארז ומתנגן בלב מזכיר דברים משם שם אל מול אותו הים כשהחולות היו לי